welcome to Cookie Pocket, an attempt at a podcast, episode 10. Today, I am finally out of hosting jail. I've served my time from my Star Wars marathon, and today we will be discussing Sergio, a historical drama directed by Greg Barker, starring Wagner Moura as Sergio Vieira de Mello and Ana de Armas as Carolina Lariera. Now, this was kind of an odd pick for me. For anyone that's watched our intro episode and has any idea of my sensitivities, I'm often more of the Star Wars blockbuster Disney garbage can stuff, as Zach might call it. So
well,
I wanted a bit of a change of pace, and also wanted to try doing a film that none of us had seen before. So I knew Ana de Armas from Knives Out, and the film sounded interesting to me, and here we are now. I'm going to start our discussion the same way we seem to always start our discussion, with general impressions and our ratings out of 5, and I'll invite either of you to start.
Okay. So I'm going to say that this is not a movie I particularly enjoyed. I liked bits of it, but I think I largely agree with Mitchell's review that he wrote. I think this is a movie that doesn't quite know what it wants to be. There are bits of this where they use a lot of news footage and a lot of interviews, and it feels like it would almost rather be a documentary. And then there are other bits where it feels like it's trying to be a straight Sergio biopic. And then there are other bits where it feels like it's trying to be a historical drama specifically about the bombing that they depict in this film that killed Sergio. And I think they don't... And then there are other bits that feels like it's meant to just be a historical romance about Sergio and Ana de Armas's character that he met like later in his life and formed a romance with. But I don't think any of those concepts, although there are good scenes that would fit into each of those different kinds of plots, I don't think any of those 4 plots are built up or developed enough to kind of take over and be, this is what this movie is. So I think in the end, though there are good scenes you can watch in isolation, it ends up feeling like kind of a pseudo-inspirational documentary mess. And I also feel like it's a little too long. I watched this movie twice, and both times it's kind of started to lose me in the middle. So not a movie I was entirely impressed with, but I can appreciate what it seemed to be going for at different places in the movie, and I gave it a 2 out of 5.
Okay, Mitchell?
Yeah, I completely agree with everything Zach said, especially because he started off by saying I mostly agree with what Mitchell said, so circular reasoning. But I think one of the problems that it really suffers from is that it really embraces that final / beginning / middle / beginning of the second act, end of second act scene where Sergio is dying / is dead. And usually that's a very artificial end of a character arc, obviously, at least in a realistic movie it is. But I think that kind of that really hurts the momentum. A lot of the thrill that you feel with Sergio doing this and that, and then you see him in this life-threatening situation, it's kind of heavily foreshadowing that he's not going to survive.
Yeah.
You can kind of pick that apart, but I think a lot of this movie, if you really enjoy the themes of it and you don't really think about it very much, then and you don't take its constant invitations to please think about it a lot, then you don't really think about how shallow it is. Because a lot of the themes that it has are very shallowly, is that a word? Very thinly portrayed. And that, I mean, I'm not saying it really is. I don't want to say, it's not really a bad thing. It is a bad thing. But if it's trying to like take all these different thematic elements and mesh them together, I don't think it really was doing that very well at all. But like Zach had said, there's a lot of scenes that are really interesting and intriguing. Like the romantic parts of it, I did not mind. I didn't think it was like I didn't think the pacing was that bad. I felt like, that the acting was good enough. I really felt like they were having a connection and things like that. And the historical aspects we'll talk about later are all right, I guess. But everything's kind of relatively mediocre, and so you pretty much mesh it together. And then by the end of the movie, when he's dying, you're like, how can you possibly feel anything at this point? We've seen the same scene like 6 or 7 times, and now he's like passed away. Like, was I supposed to be emotionally held on the entire time? Like, there was no breathing room at all? Or, it just kind of leaves me a little bit confused. But like Zach had said, there's a lot of elements that you can definitely appreciate, and a lot of scenes that were very intriguing, I guess.
And Mitchell, you mentioned the shallowness throughout. I kind of agree that this doesn't really go all that deep into the premise or the idea necessarily. But that really surprised me, because before watching the movie, I looked up Greg Barker, the director's previous work, and it looks like he's primarily a documentary filmmaker. And his previous documentaries have been well received. He actually made a documentary called Sergio in 2009, which is about this guy, and it's about his death and the people trying to save him. So going in, I thought, okay, this is a guy from a documentary background. He's going to be used to taking this research and telling a deep, complicated story with it. And I feel like he didn't really bring that game to his first attempt at a drama necessarily.
All right, those are all fair, and I agree with most of what you guys have said in spirit. I think I gave it a very high rating that I'm not sure if I still agree with. I initially gave it a 4 out of 5, and I think that's just because when I watched it, I was really struck by it. I tend to measure how much I criticize films ultimately by how much they make me think and how much they make me feel, and this film didn't really make me think in a way that was constructive and necessarily, but it definitely made me feel a lot. It was frustrating because you get a very strong sense of Sergio's empathy, but in a lot of ways his indecision and his he places too much faith in forces that are evil, and we learn about 2/3 of the way through the film that his decision to basically ask the U.S. military to leave the United Nations presence is the reason that he dies and that many others die in this terrible attack. And to me, it's really a tragic story that this guy who spends his life basically trying to free these nations and fight for ceasefires and for eventual peace, and in many cases is doing as much as he can, but is ultimately his optimism is often what stops him from achieving that peace. To me, that's like a brutally depressing truth to learn in a film like this. So despite its flaws, that emotional core hit me harder, but I agree with all your comments. It was a little confused about what it wanted to be. And I don't know. I thought it was a little odd that the same director would make a documentary and then make a historical drama about it, and maybe that's how the lines got crossed, because he was carrying over some of his older ideas or something. I don't know. But on the topic of historical accuracy, I wanted to ask Mitchell to give us just a short essence about the importance of historical accuracy in works like this, in historical dramas in general, and how that impacts, I guess, Mitchell, your specific critical analysis of a work.
I did research this a little bit, and I had to refresh myself on the Iraq War a little bit too. In terms of like the actual biographical aspects of Sergio, they did a very, very good job being accurate with what Sergio actually did, and the events that happened around him, and his relationships and things like that. All of that was very accurately portrayed, as far as I can tell, with some very minor exceptions. But as far as I can tell, I think the issue with this is that it's kind of difficult. Well, first of all, it's very difficult to portray a politically polarizing event in general. And I don't think this movie at all was trying to push any sort of political agenda or anything like that. I just want to be very clear about that. And I enjoyed those aspects of it. But I think in its shallowness, I think it kind of lacked a lot of the depth in the actual historical accuracy of things. And the worst thing that I think it did, and this is solely my opinion, is that I feel like it propped up the UN just a little bit too much. I feel as though the UN was kind of used as like another player, like they had as much influence as the coalition forces and things like that.
Mhm.
And despite the actual events that happen after Iraqi freedom, things like that, and how the U.S. actually affected Iraq and things like that, that's a different thing. But if we're talking about like everything up to the coalition forces toppling the government, Hussein's government, and things like that, the coalition forces were very much responsible for that. They had much of the power. The U.S. had the most influence in actually taking over Iraq and implementing democratic policies and things like that. So in terms of actually having Sergio being a player, and in those geopolitical things, I mean, as a person and as a UN representative for Iraq, I think that's perfectly fair. But I think propping him up against the entire historical, events and just keeping him as like this messiah or something like that, like he's the peace, he's the one arbiter of peace in this big tragic time of war and things like that. I don't think that's the best portrayal they could have done of him in that sense. I feel like that's kind of a very difficult it's very difficult terrain to cross when you're trying to make a movie like this. So I don't think they were necessarily like, I don't think they were unfair or they were too, like propping up the UN too much or something like that. I don't necessarily think that they were trying to do that. But I think it's really difficult to take a UN representative in this circumstance and make him extremely important.
Yeah, I agree. I think, after I watched the movie, I watched the trailer for the movie, which, by the way, I think is a terrible trailer. It's totally feels like an action movie almost, and it somehow gives away everything and manages not to capture any of the tension. But anyway, the big like moment that they emphasize the most towards the end of this trailer is when he's talking to the character Gil, who's meant to be a composite of Sergio's multiple colleagues.
Yeah.
And Gil's like says something along the lines of, "Oh, the most powerful official in the history of the United Nations." And then Sergio's like, "Now, what do we do with all that power?" But really, they don't have that much power at all.
Yeah.
in the grand scheme of things. And regardless of Sergio's impassioned comments otherwise, they are kind of at the mercy of the United States, especially given the conclusion where they are attacked and suffer casualties and injured because they were not under the United States protection. So,
and I should mention that the another mistake I think the movie makes, and it makes it very, very blatant, is that they're trying to compare East Timor with Iraq. And the way he's basically using the exact same approach in East Timor as he is in Iraq. And that's just, that's completely wrong. Like, it literally takes 5 minutes to figure out that the situations were completely different. But you can say the UN and was very beneficial. I mean, he was, Sergio in East Timor, he actually helped them gain their independence. He was like the leader in that area for a few years. So, I mean, that's definitely something, to give credit to. But just instantly applying that logic, saying that war is not that complicated and things like that in a very heated geopolitical environment is very difficult to portray unless you're being as shallow as they were in the movie.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of a thematic shortcut, I think, to really make those two similar.
Yeah.
Yeah. Next up, I kind of have a Zach specific question now.
Okay.
In your review, you had some gripes about towing the line between documentary and historical drama, and I just wanted to ask you more about what the difference between those two necessarily means for you, and how do you toe the line between those two, and how does that constitute your critical opinion of either?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's my opinion that if you're doing a documentary, the general idea is almost to present something as if it were the news. And I'm not necessarily talking about our United States impression of the news, where everything is in some way influenced by a political party view. I'm talking about just flat statements of the facts. Here's what happened. Here's how events developed. And you don't necessarily have a narrative, or you don't necessarily have a story as much as you have the facts and what happened. And maybe you're presenting that because you think it'll be interesting. but you're not putting like a spin on it. You don't really have a main character. You don't have a hero's journey or a romance or anything like that. You've just got the facts. Whereas with a historical drama, typically you're going to be bending things a little so you can have a narrative, so you can have specific observable character development, so you can have potentially a romance like this film does. And I do think that lends some shortcomings to this film. Another thing I mentioned in my review was that Sergio was undoubtedly a good person, but he wasn't Jesus. And I think this movie comes a little too close to, as Mitchell put it, portraying Sergio as this like messianic almost figure, because they're trying to make him this narrative main character. They're trying to make a movie about him rather than about the facts. This to me feels like Greg Barker made that 2009 documentary and he was really inspired by the events and wanted to make a drama out of them. But I feel like maybe he was a little too inspired by the person and didn't necessarily... He thought of him maybe as more of a hero than as a human being, which I think is where maybe a lot of biopics and dramas like this kind of run into trouble and start to maybe make things a little shallower than they actually were.
Yeah, well said. Thank you for that, both of you. I thought it might be interesting to peel some layers off of your critical specialties to some extent. Moving on, I wanted to ask a more generic question about the acting in general. Our two stars, Wagner Moura and Ana de Armas, are, I would argue, the heart of the film, and really the strongest positive for me was their acting, probably. But I wanted to ask your opinions about both of them.
Well, I was pretty impressed by the acting in this film. I don't necessarily think the characters that were written for them, because although they're based on real people in this movie, they are characters. I don't necessarily think the characters are all that well developed. I recognized during my second viewing that I can't say a single thing about what Ana de Armas's character wants other than to be with Sergio. And I think that's kind of a problem, because I'm sure that woman had her own goals and her own things she wanted to achieve other than to be romantically involved with our main character. But I thought the acting of those roles was pretty impressive. I found myself thinking throughout, okay, that's Sergio, rather than, okay, that's an actor playing Sergio. But I was also, outside of the leads, really struck by what I'm guessing was stunt casting for the places they went to. A scene that really occurred to me as being really fantastically acted was there's a scene where they're in East Timor, and they're in kind of like a startup business, and there's a woman weaving, and they talk to her for a while. That woman to me gave the impression of like, this is just somebody we found in the country when we got there, and we kind of asked, hey, do you want to be involved in the film? But I thought she was really great. I mean, she's not speaking English. She's not speaking a language I understand. So there's perhaps a chance that maybe the aspect to performance isn't being completely translated there for me. But I found that to be a pretty affecting scene, largely because of sort of how subtle she is and how non-actory she is, and kind of delivering that simple little speech about kind of what she wants and how she'd like to go home. I found that a really effective moment from somebody that I'm going to presume was a non-actor.
Yeah, you're right, actually. I read on IMDb trivia, actually, that that they did find someone local to do that bit, and that Wagner Moura and pretty much everyone on set like burst into tears after they finished that scene.
Oh wow!
And for me, that was probably the best emotional heart of the film, especially when you get to the flashback sequence where Sergio tells another version of that same desire. And to me, that emotional connection was very powerful. But
no, I agreed that. I mean, even the I think the main casting was all right. What was her name again? Carolina? I almost forgot.
Yes.
Yeah. Carolina was she was okay. Like you guys had said. I felt as though she should have been more independent. She didn't really. She really didn't have any other role besides to be the romantic interest of Sergio and vice versa. So, but Sergio himself I could definitely tell he was meant to be very charismatic and controlling, and being an authoritative figure. And he hits those home very, very well, very easily. So he fell into that role very well, I think. Yeah, but like Zach had said, there's very little you can actually like remember what Caroline was actually trying to do and what and her goals. But I know it was a movie about Sergio, but I mean, if he's interested in her, we kind of have to know why he's so interested in her. Maybe we don't. Maybe that's how it historically played out. I'm not sure. I'll just leave that to the wolves. But yeah, the supporting characters are very good. All the Americans that are portrayed are very accurately portrayed. I would say anybody I'm not gonna be political, but anybody who's representing the Bush administration is supposed to remind me of Bush, I would say. So like,
it was a historical drama.
Oh, you're the UN. You don't matter. We're gonna kill him. So yeah, but I really like that. And the different nationalities. The Indonesian scene was very cool. The Indonesian president really looked like the Indonesian president. Speaking from the U.S., I don't know how the actual Indonesian president was, but yeah, no, that was really good, very dramatic. And I think these select, like Christian had said, I think like in terms of like the select scenes, I think the casting was probably the best part, and also the set pieces too. I mean, they went all out with actually making you feel like you're in these very foreign areas, and they're very unique. Especially for somebody coming from somebody who lives on the East Coast in the U.S., who's never been outside of the U.S. sadly, but yeah, no, I think it was cool, and the waves and the sand and all those, emphasizing the sound of those things, and like the clock ticking in the background while they're having romantic sequences, the breeziness, the rain. So there was very much attention to detail to the set pieces as well, and that them having, if you have good acting and you have good set pieces, there's really a lot of material that you can get away with before you're disinterested as a viewer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I will say, in contrast to the scene Zach highlighted, that was kind of the best part of the movie for me. I think what really lost me, I think I literally rolled my eyes when this happened, but it's when it's like pouring rain and Sergio gets the note that East Timor wants the Indonesian president to apologize, and he's like, this is never gonna happen. They're never gonna do it. And then he walks out into the rain, and then Carolina walks out into the rain, and they like make out for a minute. Like that, it completely lost me at that point.
Was that even real rain?
It's such a Nicholas Sparks moment. It takes you totally out of it. Yeah,
it was, and it was frustrating because it felt like there was some genuine thing going on here between these two characters and these two actors that was being portrayed well, and then it's just like, they kiss, and it's like, and especially after you get that moment from Carolina where she's like, I stay away from wayward married men or whatever, and then like not long after, it's like that comment is completely thrown away. I don't know.
And Sergio's doing great things, and then he's in the rubble again, and you're like, oh man, he's about to die. Yeah. Then they're gonna have sex. Yay! He's gonna die again. Oh no.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah, I think the overall basic idea of how they structured this movie of it's going to be about the bombing, but we're going to have flashbacks to him earlier in his career. I think that's a fine structure. Right. But I think the specific places that they chose to put the flashbacks are really jarring. And the things they chose to put in the flashbacks occasionally feel like extremely jarring. Like you mentioned, Mitchell, the flashback they have to what is essentially just the sex scene. And it feels so jarring. So I like the idea of the structure, but I think in execution it didn't quite work.
Yeah. Another thing that I thought the one that stuck out most to me was probably the flashback to his children, and where he accidentally serves his son shrimp, and his son is allergic to shrimp, and he doesn't remember or know this.
Yeah.
And which I guess was supposed to be really dramatic, but to me was kind of funny at first.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's terrible. But
I actually quite liked that scene because it gave me I mean, I agree, it felt weird just on its own, but if we'd had more scenes like that that emphasized Sergio's humanity and his making mistakes and his not great relationship with his sons,
Mm-hmm.
I would have liked that because he would have felt like more of a human being than just a hero. Like, I liked that scene for what it was trying to do, but I feel like we needed more scenes like that so it didn't
Yeah.
feel just so awkward just on its own.
And his
Yeah.
wife.
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
Where
Where's
was his wife?
Yeah, they explain that he's married, but they never explain the situation with his wife. We never see her side of it. Yeah, especially
Yeah.
since they are going to pursue this romance angle with Carolina. I feel like we need some more background on that situation.
Yeah.
I think that moral bit, and then also the big decision to ask the military to leave are like the only two bits where Sergio isn't portrayed as like a perfect person.
Oh, and I should
And-
clarify that scene. I did
Oh.
research it again, Christian,
Oh.
and I told you
Okay.
that he actually didn't do that, but it was actually him and like the rest of the UN that decided not to have the rest of
Oh.
like the council that was there to not
Mm,
have the military be
jeez.
there. Specifically, there's like a big truck, like the main military presence, like this big truck in the front. He was like, "Yeah, get that out of
Oh,
here, boy.
jeez.
Listen to me. I'm the UN."
I don't know if that's
So-
better or worse. That's
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. I'm not sure whether that is better or worse. Because for me, I like the idea that they're portraying that as like a flaw and a mistake he made, but at the same time, there's a later scene where he has like this speech in the conference room where he's telling them all, yeah, we're gonna take risks, but we gotta do it to show that we're in the right. And it feels like,
yeah.
yes, he
and
made
it's
a
after
mistake.
he's in the rubble.
Yes, he
Yes.
made a mistake, but he made a mistake because he was this heroic,
Peace.
like
Yeah.
angelic person, and I felt like, I mean, if he wasn't the one who made that sole decision, it totally makes that a much more complicated and odd decision to portray it that
Mhm.
way in the movie. But
Another thing is just the general idea that I mean, obviously Sergio isn't personally at fault for the UN coming under attack, but he is at
Mhm.
fault for them being vulnerable, at least in the way that the film portrays it.
Mhm.
But they don't really the viewer has to be able-minded enough to come to that conclusion themselves, which I don't think is fair, and I don't think that the film should make it a priority to absolve Sergio. But
Mhm.
anyway, another point I wanted to address real quick is the directing, just generally, because I know our director has done pretty much documentaries, and from what I understand, this was his first non-documentary type film. And of course, I think it premiered at Sundance and was picked up by Netflix. So I mean, that's fairly successful for
Yeah.
like a first non-documentary film, I guess. So
Mhm.
did the directing stick out to either of you? Was it good, bad, or satisfactory?
Go ahead,
To-
Zach.
to me, the direction felt competent. There wasn't anything in it that stood out as fantastic at all to me. I think there are a few interesting sequences. Throughout, we keep seeing these sort of, I guess you'd call them hallucinations that Sergio is having of like his ideal trip he's gonna take with Carolina to Rio after they were done in Iraq. And he's like hallucinating that his boys are gonna be there, but they're gonna be kids again. And I thought some of the way they presented those scenes was interesting and artful in a way the rest of the movie and a lot of the times documentaries aren't. Like we've got really tight close shots of him like rubbing the sand across his face, and we've got shots of him in the water and the camera's bobbing up and down beneath the surface of the water. And I think those
Mhm.
moments looked nice and showed some kind of a vision for this beyond just put it in the frame. But I think a lot of it does kind of have that, okay, point, we're done, time for the next shot. I mean, and I don't think any of
Yeah.
it looks bad, but I'd call the direction maybe workmanlike more than artistic.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I feel like the director is very much like his own visionary. It seemed like he was taking risks to, fulfill his own vision of how he wanted Sergio to be portrayed.
Mhm.
And how that actually turned out is up to interpretation. But like Zach had mentioned, the cinematography very, very well done. I do like those sequences, and They do sometimes feel out of place. I do feel like he kind of went off in his own direction a little bit too much, in a lot of ways. But it was it was fine. I didn't really mind it too much. I don't think there's anything super critical. Like I really didn't like this one thing, or I really did super like this thing. I think it was pretty good. I don't think anything super original necessarily stood out, but I don't think it was I don't think it was necessarily like just god awful over dramatic crap,
Yeah.
Definitely not that.
All right. Yeah, I pretty much agree. I thought the water shots were really great. And I mean, I don't know much, technically speaking, about directing, but I thought he captured the heart of what he wanted to capture. So in my book, that's good directing. It seemed like it was reasonably well edited and the cinematography was good. So I didn't really have a problem with it. I have one quick question. For logistical reasons, they couldn't shoot in East Timor, so instead they shot those scenes in Thailand and brought, I guess, a couple dozen East Timorese out with costumes and whatnot. But did the locations stick out to either of you as more or less realistic, or were they just kind of a non-factor?
Well, I'm gonna admit I have no idea where East Timor is. So and that's my bad. I'm the ignorant, privileged white viewer. I don't know where East Timor is necessarily.
We forgive you, Zach.
I don't think I could point to Indonesia on a map. Yep. So, full disclosure, the locations did not distract me. I don't think, if they had tried to show off, like, here's some well-known Indonesian and East Timorese landmarks, maybe they would have stood out as being kind of awkward against all the footage, which I guess was shot in Thailand. But it never occurred to me throughout the movie, I don't think we're in East Timor. Like, I never thought that throughout, especially since a lot of the footage there is shot kind of in forested areas or on back roads, places that aren't necessarily all that distinctive from country to country. So it didn't stick out as a problem or anything all that noticeable to me.
Yeah, as far as in film goes, pretty much you can do a lot with Southeast Asia and pretty much call it any country, and the average audience member will absolutely notice it. I think it's called Timor-Leste as Sergio. I think it was on one of the folders that they had, the UN folders that mentioned that. I thought that was kind of cool. That was I think it's like north of Australia. It's like right next to Papua New Guinea.
Oh.
And Indonesia. But I don't know anything else beyond it. But yeah, no, that looked good. Hey, rainy tropical forest. I'll take that. Ruins, the Portuguese ruins and stuff he's talking about. That was cool. And yeah, Iraq, where did they film Iraq? Did they actually film it in Iraq?
I'm not sure. I didn't look that far, but I will say that it felt, I was originally going to complain because it felt like there was nothing there, but then I realized that that's probably a realistic
it
portrayal
would have been pretty bombed
of what
out,
was there.
Yeah. As far as I've seen from actual footage of Baghdad and pictures and stuff like that, it looked enough like Baghdad for it to be believable, and other films have followed suit. So
they might have shot it in like Jordan or Morocco, but I thought there were some nice details if they didn't film it in Iraq to make it look like Iraq. There's a point where you see some, like a mural on the wall of Saddam Hussein, little details like that to make it more convincing as Iraq if it wasn't actually shot there. I'm not sure.
All right. I think that's all I have. For in the way of our structured discussion.
Right.
But now I think it is time for the rundown. Yeah. I am currently typing out 2 more that I just thought of like moments ago. And then I'm going to resend it to Mitchell. And then we are going to do it.
Okay. I'm on the edge of my seat.
Me and Zach's giddy aunt are ready.
All right.
Put me in the game, coach.
Now? Okay. Sorry for that delay. So once more, an overview of this segment, 60 seconds. We say things to Zach. He responds with a rating out of 5. All right, Mitchell, are you ready?
I'm ready, Spaghetti. Am I going first?
Okay. You are.
Heck yeah.
3, 2, 1, go.
Wearing combat boots with a suit because America.
3 out of 5.
The United Nations.
3 out of 5.
Dismemberment in order to survive.
2 out of 5.
The cinematography.
3 out of 5.
Asking U.S. military protection to leave the UN presence in Baghdad.
2 out of 5.
Ana de Armas as Carolina Larriera.
3 out of 5.
Asking the Indonesian president to apologize.
3 out of 5.
War Criminals, My Friends, the autobiography.
3 out of 5.
Archival footage.
3 out of 5.
The Sound of a Kalashnikov in the Morning.
3 out of 5.
Steering clear of wayward married men.
3 out of 5.
Not Steering Clear of Wayward Married Men.
2 out of 5.
Convenient language fluency.
3 out of 5.
Wagner Moura as Sergio Vieira de Mello.
4 out of 5.
Heartstrings.
3 out of 5.
Repurposing Saddam Hussein's torture chambers.
2 out of 5.
Leaving the cab driver.
Oh, we never get to know what about the cab driver. Oh well.
That's the nature of the rundown.
Yep.
All right. Zach, would you like to preview our next episode for our listeners?
Oh, absolutely. So I had to do a little bit of rearranging to find a new film to plan for next week because my original idea proved to be unavailable. But we are going to be watching and talking about I Don't Feel at Home in This World Anymore next week, or next episode, rather, which is a revenge comedy from 2017 starring Elijah Wood. And
Ooh.
I think we're going to have a lot of fun with it. It's a very quirky, kind of offbeat comedy. And some people probably wouldn't find it all that funny, but I think it's definitely going to be interesting to talk about.
All right. Great. Thanks, both of you, for providing your thoughtful insights and for making this a good discussion, even though this wasn't necessarily your cup of tea.
Yeah.
That's all for us.
Ginseng's good. Green. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm a coffee guy.
You heard it here first.
Yes, Mitchell is a coffee guy. This has been Cookie Pocket, an attempt at a podcast, episode 10. Goodbye. Stay safe. Yeah.